So last session we discussed about various methods of adding components. So what are components and how we can add components, the various techniques of using them. Right. Now after understanding the basic of adding components using commands, the important commands, now we need to understand data binding in Angular. Actually, data binding is a technique used in web application, and it is the process of binding the data to the front-end application UI. So data binding is nothing but it is the process of collecting value, storing in a reference, and binding to the user interface to render as output actually. That means we collect value from user, so and store in reference and bind to UI so that you can show that to the user interface, or it can be accessing data from data object and binding to UI. That is the technique of data binding. Accessing data from any object and binding to the UI. That means presenting. So presentation. That's what actually data binding is. And to handle this data binding, Angular uses MVC and MVVM frameworks. It uses MVC and MVVM frameworks client side. For handling data binding, it uses the frameworks MVC and MVVM. So these frameworks are responsible for handling data binding in Angular actually. So internally, Angular uses the frameworks MVC and MVVM. I will just give you an overview. So what is MVC actually? So MVC is a software architectural pattern. It is a software architectural pattern. Software architectural pattern means they are same like design patterns, but have a broader scope. That means they are responsible for building application, and also control application flow. So these frameworks are responsible for handling both building the application and controlling the application flow. So architectural patterns, so many are there. Software architectural patterns, MVCs and software architectural pattern. There are so many software architectural patterns. So that is a separate concept, design patterns, architectural patterns. So we will not go into that. So just an overview about what is MVC. Generally, architectural patterns means they are responsible for 2 points: building application and controlling the application flow. There are so many architectural patterns actually. Let me show you various types of architectural patterns actually. Yep. So in the design patterns, you need to understand as the design patterns actually. Yeah, in software development, I hope many of you know about design patterns and architectural patterns. Design patterns are used for creating objects, designing classes, and handling the communication. And design patterns are categorized into three groups actually. We call them as gang of four. 23 design patterns are there: creational, structural, behavioral. So this is a very different and a big concept. A software developer already knows about design patterns and all. I'm not going into that. But design patterns are about three things. Creational patterns, they deal with object creation mechanism. Structural patterns deal with designing of classes. And behavioral patterns deal with communication actually. So these are responsible for building the application, but not controlling the application flow. To control the application flow, these are all creational patterns: abstract, factory, builder, factory method, prototype, singleton. These are creational patterns. Structural patterns like adapter, bridge, composite, decorator, facade, flyweight, proxy. These are structural patterns. And behavioral patterns, these are behavioral patterns. Chain of responsibility, command, interpreter, iterator, and all these are behavioral patterns. Architectural patterns, software architectural patterns are similar to design patterns, but they have broader scope. That means they are responsible for both building application and controlling the application flow. And these are all the architectural patterns: blackboard system, broker pattern, event-driven architecture, implicit invocation, layers, microservices, MVC, MVP, MVVM. So Angular is actually using the design patterns MVC, and it is using MVVM. Angular uses these two so internally. Now first we need to understand what is this MVC and MVVM, how they work actually. So technically, what is MVC and what is MVVM? Actually, that is the key point we need to understand generally. So they are architectural patterns. So architectural patterns are responsible for building application and controlling application flow. Actually, MVC was introduced. MVC is Model View Controller. That is MVC. MVC was introduced in early 1970s by Trygve. He introduced the concept of MVC. It was first used with a language called Smalltalk. The main concern of MVC is code reusability and code separation. Actually, Trygve was working on a British Oil Corporation project. And in that project, he was facing the problem with the user interface, logic, and data. So actually, he was working on a very big desktop application. And that desktop application actually contains logic, and it contains data, and it contains UI. Now, all together at one place was causing a lot of issue because they are not separated, tightly coupled, easy, not easy for extending, not easy for testing. To overcome this issue, he designed a framework. He separated the application into three components. One is controller, another one is model, and another one is view. So application is separated into three components actually. Model represents the data. Model represents the data. It defines the rules for manipulating the data. It even contains data validation rules. Actually, model contains data. In client side, we call that as POJO. POJO means plain old JavaScript objects. POJO means plain old JavaScript objects actually, JavaScript objects. So data is represented in the form of POJO, plain old JavaScript objects. Data is present in JavaScript object. So whatever data required for application is present in model. Model contains the data. Model represents the data. So data is present in model. And controller contains application logic. Controller contains application logic. All the application logic is present inside the controller. That means it controls the overall application flow. So that means it accepts request from the user. It processes the request, connects with the database, connects with the model, gets the data and returns the data. The entire all interactions are handled. All the interactions are handled. The entire application flow is handled by controller. Controller contains the application specific logic. And view contains the UI, user interface. View contains the user interface. So it describes the application user interface. That means it contains the HTML to be presented. Actually, view is under the control of view engine. We have view engines. And it is responsible for processing and rendering the output to the UI, user interface. Angular uses a view engine called Ivy. Ivy is the name of the view engine used by Angular for rendering the output. That means view is nothing but user interface. The presentation is in the view. That means generally what happens is how this framework works. So we have the client. So from the client, the request comes. From the client, when request comes, the request will first come to, so client interacts from the view. And from the view, the interaction is sent to controller. Controller will process that request, and if necessary, it connects with the model. It stores the data in the model. It gets the data from the model. And it sends the data to the view. That means entire communication between model and view is managed by controller. So remember, in a MVC framework, view will not send any data to model. Directly view will not send any data to model. It will not do that. And model will not send anything directly to view, will not send anything directly to the view. It cannot happen. So everything is under the control of controller. So from UI, it goes to controller. From controller, it goes to model. In simple terms, suppose I will tell you here. So we have a button in the UI. Button on click, what action to perform, that is defined here. And model contains the data. So where you can store the data and access the data. So this is general application flow. So very simple, I explained you that model contains data, controller contains application logic, and the view contains the UI, user interface. Now here the key point is, so in this framework, that means Angular is using this MVC framework. MVC framework is not new. Every technology is using this MVC framework. For example, Java uses MVC framework by name Spring. PHP uses MVC framework by name Cake PHP, Code Igniter. Python uses MVC by name Django, so by name Flask. And Ruby uses MVC by name Ruby on Rails. And .NET uses MVC by name ASP.NET MVC. JavaScript uses MVC by name Spine, by name AngularJS, and so many others, Angular and all. So MVC is known to every technology. Every technology is using MVC. It's not new. It's a very old framework introduced in early 1970s. And all technologies are using this MVC framework. Our Angular is also using this MVC framework. So MVC framework. Usually this MVC framework separates your application into three components: the model, the view, and the controller that handles the data binding actually. Now actually in this framework, data is present in model, logic is present in controller, and view present in UI. In our component that we designed, so this is the component that we designed. Suppose we have register.component.html. So this is view, that is the UI. View is the UI, user interface. And register.component.ts that contains the logic, it is controller. That means our component controller is this TS file that contains all the logic, and our component view is that HTML, and our component related data is present in, data can be stored in JavaScript objects client side. These objects can be maintained in several locations. You can maintain these objects in component directly, in component TS. You can maintain these objects in component HTML. You can even maintain in service.ts. JavaScript objects can be maintained anywhere in a separate service. So in a separate component TS file or component HTML file. So wherever you are keeping this data, so JavaScript objects, this is referred as model. So model contains the data. So you can maintain the data in the TS. In the controller, you can maintain the data in the HTML. You can maintain the data in a separate service. You can access them and use them. I will show you all the techniques. So technically, so in our Angular application, we have readily both controller and view. So the controller for our Angular application is this component TS file, which contains the logic. And the view is the UI. HTML is the user interface. Now here the key point is how data is passed from controller to view. That means how data is passed from controller to view, how we can access the data from controller to view, how data is passed from view to controller. This is the technique. These are the options we have to understand. How data is passed. Data is present. How data is passed from controller to view. That is the first point we need to understand. So Angular uses various data binding techniques to pass data from controller to view. So what are those data binding techniques? Two types of data binding techniques are there. We have one-way binding and we have two-way binding. So many technologies support only one-way binding. One of the main reason why people are majorly migrated to Angular, so it's a two-way binding technique. One-way binding is nothing but in one-way binding technique, the data will be passed from controller to view. It is only one direction. And it is read only and forward only. That means in a one-way binding technique, what happens is, so we have a controller. In one-way binding technique, we have controller, and we have view. What happens in one-way binding technique is the data will be passed from the controller to view. It is only one direction. It is passed from controller to view. So whatever data is present in model, so model contains some data. It will collect that data and it will pass the data into view. This is one direction and this is one way. So one way. And it is a read only. It is read only and it is forward only. That means it is only one direction, read only and forward only. That means, so any change performed in the view, that means I sent some data from controller to view. So that means in the view, we are displaying the data, some name John. And the name John is present here. And we are sending the data to that view. If anyone changes this in the view, that means make changes in that view, changed the name to David. This change will not be updated back to the controller. It will not go back. That means it is read only. The changes are not updated back. Only one direction. That means it can access the data and it can display the data. One-way binding. This mechanism is called one-way binding. So many technologies will support only one-way binding. Even you might have heard React.js like technologies. They don't support two-way binding. They support only one-way binding. Angular supports both of them, one-way binding and two-way binding. We will see so how this is handled, so and how we can manage this. So what is one-way binding and how we can deal with the one-way binding? Let's see one simple example for that. So technically, what is one-way binding? Collecting the data and presenting in the UI. Actually, in Angular, so one-way binding is one-way binding. One-way binding can be handled. One-way binding can be handled in three ways. Again, one-way binding can be handled in three ways. We have a technique called interpolation. And we have binding to attribute, and we have binding to property. So people call as attribute binding, property binding, and interpolation. How it allows, we will see that. How it works, we will see that. Let's create one simple example. That means how we can collect the data and present the data. Let's see. So I'm adding here a new component. Let's add a new component. In the components folder, we are generating a component, ng generate component data binding, and skip test. I will skip the test. I don't want a test file currently. Later when we want, we can add it. So then only 3 files will be generated. So that is the TS file, the CSS file, and the HTML file. So we are generating a component data binding. Okay. After that, now register this component, make this component in the startup. Okay. So I will go to app module and I will make this component in the startup data binding. So in the bootstrap, right, we will change it data binding, and in index, I will use app data binding. Usually it will be the same name that you have given for the component, app data binding. That's how we need to define. Now let's run this and see. So ng serve open project is equal to Amazon. Okay, we haven't done anything. So ng serve project is equal to Amazon. Okay. So here we haven't done anything, just application is there. Let's run that. And let's go to, if it is ready, we will see. So let's go to the component now. In the components, we have a data binding component. In that we have a TS file. In the TS file, so we will add some data. This is the component TS file. I will remove the unnecessary logic here. I will just keep the class. No other options are required. I will just keep the class. Okay. Now, already we learned we can create our own or we can configure. I am just generating through the command. Now here, so I will remove this init and all, just component. Now, currently it is working fine. Let's compile and run this and see. So localhost data binding is working. Okay. Currently, we don't have anything customized here. So in this data binding component, I am creating the data. That means I am declaring a property, product. Product is a property, means it is an object type property. Already we learned in TypeScript, object type, array types and all. Here you can directly define the property. And so what type it is? Object. So in that we are adding details, name. So name, so some name Samsung TV. Okay. And price, some price. And some in stock is true, some Boolean value. So this is the data we have in controller. We need to present this data. So we need to present the data in the UI. We need to present the data in the UI. So in the UI, this is controller. This is controller. That means the component TS file is considered as controller. This we want to present in the UI. Then let's go to its HTML file. Here I want to present the data. Here I want to present the data. How you present the data? So I will put a div and a heading, product details. And I need to access the data and display the data. I am creating a data list, data term. So say product name. And I want to display the data here. I want to display the data. Now important is how to access the data from the controller and bind it to you. That's what we are learning, data binding. Data binding is a technique of accessing the data and binding in the UI. It can be done in several ways. The first technique, interpolation. In interpolation, actually, what is interpolation technique? There are three ways of data binding: interpolation, attribute binding, property binding. Interpolation is nothing but, so it binds by it uses data binding expression. So this is curly braces. That is the data binding expression. Actually, this data binding expression, the problem is it is not binding. It is not binding to any DOM element. DOM element means HTML element. It is not binding to any HTML element. Actually, it is just displayed as literal. Literal means normal text inside element. It is not binded to any element. And one of the advantages is it allows expression. It allows to build expression and return the value. That is what actually data binding interpolation means. Interpolation means, for example, see here, this is data definition. Generally, if you know JavaScript, if you want to display some value inside this data definition, actually what happens in JavaScript is that data definition will have an ID as LBL name. And we need to get the data and bind it. Then we use document.get element by ID, and LBL name. And into that, we have to bind the data by using inner HTML, or we can use inner text by using inner HTML, inner text, outer HTML. In that inner HTML, we need to bind the data. That is product.name. We need to access that. This is how generally we do in JavaScript. But here, we don't need all these DOM manipulations. Simply, what we can do is, we can access the product object name, and we can display inside this data definition by using and binding expression. Here I can directly access product.name. That's it. So it is not binding to data definition. It is just displaying inside that literal. Similarly, another data term. So some price data definition. Here I am adding product.price. Another data term is stock. And what is advantage is it allows you to build an expression also. It allows you to build an expression. So how it can build any expression? So we can directly write here. So stock is a Boolean value. True. That means I am writing a condition. By using ternary operator, product dot in stock is equal to true. If stock is equal to true, question mark, I want to print available, available. Else I want to print out of stock. That's the expression you can build and you can access and bind. That means whatever data is present, we are accessing the data and binding to the UI, and you can see the data is presented here. So we have the details like name, we have the details like price, and we have the details. That means the name, the price, and the stock. Just for temporary here. Now important is when you are creating the presentation, to make the presentation more effective, and you can use Bootstrap. So, and it is very common that in the presentations we use Bootstrap for making the presentation more effective, and it is a very common thing in development. So you can install Bootstrap and enable Bootstrap so that you can use that in the presentation. So I will show you how we can use Bootstrap for making the presentation more better. So technically, if you use Bootstrap, then you don't need to write much styles. So it will be easy for you for presenting. And for that, you have to know Bootstrap first. How to enable Bootstrap in our project so that we can start using Bootstrap. We can use Bootstrap, and additionally, Angular also have predefined templates like Bootstrap. We call that as Angular material. But Angular material is also limited. It is not having everything that you need. That's the reason we need a combination of material and Bootstrap. I will show you both. You can use Bootstrap for making the presentation simple. How? So you have to enable Bootstrap for your project. So let's go to the terminal. Here, open your project terminal. That means your workspace terminal. In this workspace terminal, install Bootstrap. So if you install in this workspace, you can access and use in any project. So I will install Bootstrap. How to install Bootstrap? npm install. So Bootstrap, that's it. npm install Bootstrap. It will install Bootstrap for you. Add Bootstrap into your project. npm install Bootstrap. I'm just running that command npm install Bootstrap, and Bootstrap is installed. So once Bootstrap is installed, actually Bootstrap is ready. It is installed successfully. Okay. After installing the Bootstrap, actually Bootstrap is installed in your workspace. That means into the node modules, the Bootstrap is added. So in the node modules, the Bootstrap will be available. So the Bootstrap is added here. And you know the Bootstrap library. So you have to use this in your project. Then what you can do is, in your project, you can go to the styles CSS file. In the project, you have styles CSS file. In the styles CSS file, you can import that Bootstrap. That means @import. And you have to import that Bootstrap where it is present. We have to come out of the current folder, because remember, so styles.css is present in it is present in the app folder. Styles.css is present in this app folder. We have to come out of app folder. We have to come out of SRC folder. We have to come out of projects, and we need to go to node modules. That means actually here I need to write ... /. So here again ... /. It will come out of Amazon, again ... /. Now here we have node modules. In the node modules, we have Bootstrap. In Bootstrap, dist. In dist, we have CSS. And we have Bootstrap, bootstrap.css. This is the file we have to import. If you import the file into styles.css, now Bootstrap is available to entire project. We installed Bootstrap in the workspace and we are using for our project. In that workspace, any project can use this Bootstrap. Currently, Bootstrap CSS is enough. And you see now, I used Bootstraps, I enabled Bootstrap, automatically some changes happen now. Because Bootstrap by default have some effects. Okay, let's do this now. Let's go to data binding component and put it here class as container fluid. So fluid. And you can see now the indentation will change a little bit. Okay. I want the presentation here, data term, data list will use a class called row. And the data term will use a class, so it will use a class called call, so SM or MD, so and medium or small, and it will use 3. That means 3 columns. And this class will use call, MD, medium. This is 10 columns. That means we are defining the space 3 and 10. That means for the terms and definitions. So we are defining row and means we are arranging the content. Suppose we define, suppose this is like call 3. And this is like call, suppose some 6 columns occupying, how much columns it should occupy. We can display like this. And similarly, all data terms will use 3 columns. All data terms will use 3 columns and all data definitions will use 6 columns. So we are arranging the content in this way and we are displaying the content in this way. So 6 is more than you can add here as 4 columns. We can change it to 4 columns because it depends on how you want to adjust the width and define the width. We can arrange the content accordingly. So this is all how you can manage your content and display the content. These Bootstrap things, you need to learn Bootstrap first for presentation. So side by side arranging and all this, we have to know the Bootstrap. And if you are not aware of Bootstrap, so we will see a few basic things of Bootstrap that you can implement here. Right? You can present in any way. I'm just presenting a data list, or you can use a tabular form. And here I'm using the class as table and the table hover, that is the table. And here we have a tr, td. So in this we have name, and in another cell, so we are presenting product.name. Anyway, whatever you want, you can configure. Another data term, another row. This is the row for name. We are presenting another row. In that we have the price, and we need to display the price, and we are configuring product.price. And these are the Bootstrap related attributes that we are using. And another row, so in the cell we have stock and table term. So here we are displaying so an expression. So product dot in stock is equal to true, then it will display available, and otherwise it will say out of stock. So that's what we are presenting, and we are presenting the data in a tabular form. This is a table. That's how you can configure the presentation, and we can use the presentation, right? We are implementing the classes and we are configuring the classes and we are using it. So we have the tables, the definition for the table here. So so many options are there. Table related, so many options are there. Table dark. So it will get the presentation and display there. So these are all generally according to your requirements. You can use Bootstrap. We will use Bootstrap everywhere to make the presentation more faster and easier instead of writing the styles. Now, important here, what is the technique you have seen is interpolation. In interpolation, you have seen that we can access the data and bind that through an expression. That is interpolation. But this is having one problem. Why it is called one-way binding? What is problem in this actually? Suppose you see now, technically, I will go to and I will change this in stock is false. Okay. If in stock is false, this will be updated to the UI. That means automatically it's out of stock. That means whatever data is present, it is binded to the UI. According to that, it is displaying it. It is binded to the UI. According to that, it is displaying. That's good. Okay. What is problem in interpolation? The key point, what is the problem in interpolation is, it is one-way binding and it will not update the changes for elements. For example, see here, I am creating a simple property here as disable button. Disable button is true. So that means it is using true, a Boolean value. So disable button true. We are defining a Boolean value. Let's go here in the design. I will just keep a button below. I will just keep a button here. So button. So button, I am giving some text, something like submit. And here button is having so a class, some BTN and BTN primary. So that is the button class. So you have a submit button. You see there is a submit button here. Currently submit button is working fine. So there is a submit button. We haven't written any logic for that. It's there. Now I want to disable this button. Then we are using button have a property disabled. You know that disabled. Into that disabled, we are passing this value. So that means it requires true or false. And that is present in disable button. Disable button contains true. That means we will pass that here disable button. That means disabled is true. Because disable button is a property which returns true. So that true is applied, disabled is true. And you can see that. So submit button is disabled. It is not working fine. It is not working. To make it more clear in the presentation, you can do one thing. So what you can do is, so you can go to the CSS file, and here I am writing the CSS. If button is disabled, then cursor, I will put cursor, I will put cursor as not allowed. I will put the cursor as not allowed. So that means now see what happens when I move the mouse onto it, it will show that it is disabled. So not allowed cursor will come on for the submit button. So currently submit is disabled. Okay, it is disabled. And I will go here, I will change this. I will change this to false. Disabled is false. whenever any change made in the value, this change, so because you are disabling the button, this change must be updated here. That means any change happened, it must be updated here. That means disabled, this disabled should be false now. Already it is false because you're given false, it is false. If disabled is false, it should enable. And you can see that it is not enabled. I will refresh this. You can see it is not enabled. That means any change that you made in the value and this change is not of the button is not set to false. For example, I will show you here. I will show you. For example, if disabled is true, by default first it is true. Let's display this value below that button. For your understanding sake, I will keep that disable button. You can see disable button value is true. So disable is true. I will go there and I will make changes in this from true to false. I will make change from true to false. And you can see that it is to false, but still it is not enabled. So disabled is false, value is false, but it is not updating in the UI because interpolation is one-way binding. Interpolation is one-way binding. That means forward only, one-time binding. It binds that, after binds it disconnects. It disconnects. Even you change the value, it is not going to reflect in the element. This is not suitable if you want continuous changes. If you want continuous changes. If you want your element to change according to the situation, then interpolation is not great. Interpolation is good for one-way binding. That means interpolation uses one-way binding. It is good for one time. It is good for one time. So it is not good if you are doing multiple times. So that means continuous changes. If you are handling continuous changes, then it is not good to use interpolation. So interpolation is handling data binding. So it will access the data and it will bind the data. But and one advantage is interpolation will allow expression. Interpolation will allow expression. And but problem is it is one direction only, one-way binding only. That means any change will not be reflected back. This is the problem with interpolation. So if you don't want continuous updates, if you don't want continuous changes, then you can better go with interpolation. If you want some expressions to handle in the UI, so then you can just use this interpolation technique. So, but the problem already we saw that the problem is this. So that is what actually interpolation is. Now you can use instead of interpolation, you can use binding to attribute binding or property binding. You can use attribute binding and property binding. I hope majority of you know in HTML that what is difference between attribute and property. I hope you have learned in general HTML. So in HTML image img src. So here src is an attribute. We created an image from new image and here img.src. Here src is a property. You know this in general HTML and JavaScript. Tags comprises of attributes. That's what we discussed, right? That means interpolation is not binding with the element. Am I right? Huh? It is not binding with any DOM element. You observe this line? Huh? Observe that line, huh? Right? DOM element means button. Understood? Huh? Right? You know HTML DOM elements, button, text box, so forms, images, all these are DOM elements. When you are literally displaying the text, that's okay. Literally when you are displaying, it is working. Na? In the output, it is showing true or false here. True, false, changed. Na? When I change to true, it says true. When I change to false, it says false. Literally it is working, but it is not affecting on the DOM elements. That is what actual interpolation is. Huh? Yes. So technically, literally it is working, but it is not updating the changes in the DOM. That is the point. So now don't think that it is changing. It is not changing, right? It is changing. Suppose I change it to disable button, I change it to true. The value changes to true. You see the value changed to true. Here it shows that it is true, but it is not affecting here. It is not affecting here, whatever the changes. That means it is not affecting on the DOM. That is the reason this line is important to understand. It is not binding to any DOM element. That is the problem actually. Now we have two options. So we can bind, so we can handle. So by using this technique, we have property binding and attribute binding. First, we need to know what is the difference between property and attribute. Tags contains attributes and elements contain properties. If you are dynamically handling, and you know that every element don't have the same name attributes. For example, img have class, but image. So, but image when you create dynamically, so img is not having class. It is having class name as property. There cannot be same names every time. Sometimes they are same. This is attribute. img class is attribute and img class name is a property. So you can bind to property or you can bind to attribute. Interpolation is just a binding expression. It is using a literal. You can bind to property and you can bind to attributes. For that, first you need to understand what is difference between property and attribute. So properties are mutable, attributes are immutable. Attributes cannot change the state dynamically, but property can change the state dynamically. That is what the difference between property and attribute. Property and attribute. So how we can bind with properties and how we can bind with attributes. That is what we call attribute binding and property binding. So what is difference between attribute and property is same like you learned in TypeScript. What is the difference between variable and property? So attributes are like variables and property is property. Attribute is immutable. It cannot change the state according to the situation, but property can change. Property can change. So Angular can allow you to bind any data to the element property or to the element attribute. That means here currently we are not binding this data to the element property or element attribute. We are not binding. Here we are not binding to element attribute or element property. So here we are just displaying as a literal. Suppose if I want to bind to this table cell. So then for that we need to learn data binding, property binding, attribute binding. Generally, if I have to bind to this particular cell, you can see table cell. Currently it is not there, empty. If I want to bind here, then I can use table cell will have a property. Table cell will have a property. So in the table cell, if you want to display anything, For example, if it is a text box have a property value. But for a table cell, you have a property in JavaScript. I think you know that table cells will have a property so called inner HTML. They have a property inner HTML. And to bind anything to property, properties are written in square brace. In the square brace, we have to use the property. And property is inner HTML. Inner HTML. Inner HTML is a general property of JavaScript. And to this property, we have to bind the value product.name. This is property binding. And you can see that it will get that and it will display that. That's working fine. Interpolation uses an expression, and property binding allows you to bind to the property of that particular element. What is advantage of this property binding, and what is drawback, and what is data attribute binding? These are the things we need to discuss now. That means interpolation, you saw that. Now what is property binding, attribute binding? What is the difference between property and attribute binding? And what is two-way binding, one-way binding? That is the process. Remember, these are all one-way binding. Interpolation, property binding, attribute binding, all comes under one way. That you will see that they are all one way. If you want two-way binding, handle two-way binding. That also we will see. That we will see in our next session. Tomorrow we will see that. Today you try up to this interpolation. In the example I will give you in the notes. So up to interpolation, and how attribute and property bindings are used, and how two-way binding is used. That we will see with examples in the next session. Tomorrow we will discuss about that. Okay.